All right, let's jump into this deep dive. We're going to be looking into Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation.
Okay.
And the stuff that you've sent me, it paints such a fascinating and kind of like a bizarre picture of this guy and his organization. So I'm excited to really get into it.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
So first of all, like what should we know? Like how did this guy, rise to be a spiritual leader? What's the deal with that?
Well, one thing that's interesting is that his story is really tied in with the history of Etiquette,
Okay.
which is the International Society for Krishna Consciousness.
Yeah.
And it's not like a normal spiritual leader kind of story.
Okay, yeah, tell me more about that.
So it's the late 1970s, and Chris Butler, who wasn't going by Siddhaswarupananda at the time.
Right, his initiated name.
Right, exactly. He just shows up on the scene of Etiquette.
Okay.
And he doesn't come empty-handed either. He comes with a big donation, some property in Hawaii, and a following of like 50 to 100 people.
Whoa, that's a bold move. Like, hey, everybody, here I am. Right, yeah.
That's a powerful way to like step onto the scene.
Yeah, totally. And that's kind of where we see the first bit of controversy starting to pop up around him and his movement.
Okay.
Because there are all these conflicting accounts about what his relationship with ISKCON's founder was like.
Okay, yeah.
With A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami.
Right.
And, some people say that there was tension there and disagreement.
Okay.
Whereas Butler himself kind of paints himself as this martyr figure who's like being opposed by all these corrupt people within ISKCON.
Oh, wow. So it's like a power struggle within a spiritual movement.
Yeah, like what's really going on there?
Yeah, like behind the scenes, right?
Exactly.
Oh, that's interesting. And before ISKCON, he was already doing something, right?
Right. So he had already established something called the Krishna Yoga Community.
Okay.
And that actually had some connections to the Sivananda ashram.
Okay.
So that adds like another layer to it, like where is he coming from?
Yeah, what shaped his spiritual path, right?
Exactly. So then he and ISKCON part ways. It doesn't work out.
Right.
He goes and forms his own thing, the Science of Identity Foundation.
Uh-huh.
So SEF is we're calling it.
Yeah.
They're not just like one place, right? Like they've got all these different names for their centers.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes it's based on the location. And sometimes they incorporate names like Czaitania or Gauranga.
Huh.
Yeah.
It's almost like they're trying to blend in while they're spreading, right?
Right. Yeah.
Kind of fly under the radar.
And that's a big part of how they recruit people, too.
Oh, how so?
It's like all these different tactics. They do outreach in public spaces like libraries and universities.
Okay.
They've used platforms like WWO, which is like that organic farming thing.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And they've even like partnered with massage schools.
Wow. That's interesting. I've definitely seen like Wailana Yoga with his chanting.
Right.
They've got products too, right? Like chips and...
Yeah, like Achita's veg chips.
Yeah, and like noni juice, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, healing noni juice and...
Healing noni juice, right?
Yeah, all sorts of things. So it's like they're trying to weave themselves into like all these different parts of your life.
Wow. That's a very deliberate, like all-encompassing kind of strategy.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that.
What is it?
Butler believes in something called subliminal indoctrination.
Okay.
It's like this idea that if you're exposed to his chants over and over again, or if you eat prasadam, which is food that's been offered to Krishna,
right,
then you'll be more receptive to his teachings.
So it's not just like going to a meditation group, right?
Right.
It's like adopting this entire lifestyle that revolves around him.
Exactly.
And when you start looking at those teachings, like, things get kind of creepy.
Yeah, that's where you get into like the darker side of Sif.
Okay.
You know, all the allegations about cult-like behavior.
Yeah.
People who used to be followers have said that the organization demands total obedience to Chris Butler. And if you question anything or disagree, you face some pretty serious consequences.
Like what?
It could be anything from fines to public humiliation to being completely cut off from the community.
Wow. So no room for like individual thought or dissent?
It seems that way.
That's intense.
Yeah.
And this control, like, it bleeds into every part of their lives, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Former members have talked about like restrictions on what kind of work they can do, who they can marry, even like what they can study.
Really? Wow.
There are stories of people getting punished severely for really minor things.
Oh, wow.
And there's this constant pressure to stay isolated from anyone outside of Siv.
So this leads to like those super close-knit communities where everyone's intermarrying.
Right, because you're not supposed to marry anyone who's not a devotee.
Right. It's interesting, like, on the one hand, you can see how that would create a strong sense of belonging.
Right.
But you're also giving up a lot of freedom.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah.
You're giving up a lot of personal autonomy.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got a potentially controlling leader, a secretive organization with some, like, questionable tactics.
Yeah.
This really close-knit community that's kind of cut off from the rest of the world.
Right.
What about, like, the political influence? That was another thing that surprised me.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It's like a case study in how a group that's relatively small can gain a lot of political power.
Yeah.
And Butler's been especially good at getting into the Hawaiian government.
Oh, right. Like the Independence for Godly Government Party back in the 70s.
Exactly.
I mean, it eventually, like, fell apart, right?
Right.
But there were all those accusations about dirty tactics.
Yeah, and some people claim that Butler was the one ordering those tactics.
Wow. And then you've got the Gabbards.
Right.
Like Mike Gabbard, who goes by Krishna Das in Seth.
Yeah.
He was elected to the state senate in Hawaii.
Uh-huh. His wife, Carol Gabbard, who's Davaruti Dasi within SIF.
Right.
She spent a ton of money to get on the Board of Education.
Yeah.
And their daughter, Tulsi Gabbard Tamayo, she won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives.
It's not just that they've been successful, though, right? Like, they've switched parties over time.
Right.
Mike Gabbard went from Republican to Democrat.
Yeah, right after he got elected, too.
And a huge chunk of his campaign contributions, they came straight from SIF members.
Right, yeah. It's hard not to see Butler's influence there.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like a web, right?
Oh,
like
yeah.
all these connections, and who knows what everyone's motivations are.
Exactly. It's very complicated, but it goes back to, like, Butler wanting to get as much political influence as possible.
Hmm.
He's even told his followers to go after jobs in law enforcement and government.
Oh, wow. So you've got this potentially controlling leader,
Yeah.
this secretive organization, these kind of shady tactics, all this political influence.
Mm-hmm.
What about Chris Butler's teachings?
Oh, well, that's where things get even more complex.
Okay.
Butler says that he's a pure devotee of Krishna,
Okay.
and that puts him on the same level as Jesus Christ.
Okay.
And he teaches that because he's a pure devotee, anything he does is pleasing to God. Even if it goes against what he tells his followers to do, or even if it goes against scripture.
So it's like he can justify anything, even if it contradicts his own teachings.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. And that's actually one of the big criticisms of his teachings.
Okay.
Because critics say, you know, by emphasizing that he's divine, he's basically creating a system where no one can question him or hold him accountable.
Right. Yeah.
And that can lead to abuse and manipulation.
Right, especially with all the allegations we've been talking about.
Exactly.
And this idea that chanting and eating prasadam will make you more receptive to his teachings. It's like a form of control, isn't it?
Yeah, potentially.
Yeah.
Like, it keeps people focused on rituals instead of thinking critically.
Right, yeah.
And it keeps them from questioning his authority.
Wow, this is getting pretty heavy. We need to take a break.
Yeah, let's pause here for a minute and come back to this.
Yeah, we'll be back soon to explore even more about Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation.
Sounds good. Okay, so you know how before the break we were talking about all those internal letters?
Yeah.
Those mention people like Krishna Karthadas and Syamasundara Das.
Yeah, like what are those real names, or is it like some SIF code?
Yeah, so those are the initiated names they use within SIF.
Oh. Well,
Like how Butler took on the name Siddhasvarupananda.
right, right.
So those individuals are actually Mike Gabbard
Oh, okay.
and Sunil Kameni.
Okay.
And they had some pretty important roles within SIF.
Interesting.
Like in some of the letters, Mike Gabbard or Krishna Karthadas is even referred to as Butler's Secretary of Personal Affairs.
Oh, wow. So they were close.
Yeah, definitely.
So it's not just Mike Gabbard who's tied to SIF, right?
Yeah.
Like
yeah.
his wife's involved, his daughter's involved, and now we've got Sunil Kameni working for Tulsi Gabbard, helping her raise money and reach out to Hindu Americans.
Yeah.
So is this like a coincidence, or is this part of a bigger plan?
Well, you know how Butler's told his followers to get positions of influence in government? It doesn't seem like it's just happening by chance.
Right.
It looks like it's a strategy to push SIF's agenda forward.
And that's the question, right? Like,
Yeah.
what is that agenda?
Right, exactly.
We've talked about how they recruit people, how much control they have over their followers, but like, what are they really after?
Yeah, it's the million-dollar question.
Right.
It's hard to say for sure because SIF is super secretive. And Butler's teachings, they're full of all this esoteric language and symbols.
It's like really hard to decipher.
Exactly.
But like one thing that's really clear is how much Butler emphasizes absolute obedience.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Like he wants total loyalty, and if you disagree with him, you're in trouble. It's almost like he's building this army of followers who will do whatever he says without questioning it.
Right. That's a good point. And a lot of former members have said the same thing.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they talk about this culture of fear and intimidation where you just can't question Butler's authority at all.
That's wild.
Yeah, it's concerning, especially with all the allegations of financial shenanigans and those ties to QNet.
Right, right. It makes you wonder about Tulsi Gabbard, too.
Yeah.
Like, she keeps saying she's not connected to SIF anymore.
Yeah.
But her family's so involved, her staff has SIF members, and she's gotten all this money from them.
Right. It's hard to ignore all that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So what are her motives, right?
Yeah, like, is Butler's stuff influencing her political decisions?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's definitely something for voters to consider.
Okay, so we've gone over SIF's history, how they recruit, the accusations of cult-like behavior, their political influence, and this big question mark over their goals. Is there anything else we need to talk about before wrapping up?
Well, there are a few more interesting things from the sources.
Yeah.
You know how Butler just showed up at IceKCon with that huge donation and all his followers?
Yeah, like a rock star, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
But just 6 months before that, he was actually promoting his own group, the Krishna Yoga Community, which was connected to the Sivananda ashram.
Interesting. So it's like, why did he even join ISKCon in the first place?
Exactly. Like, was he really converting, or was it a strategic move?
To get more followers.
Yeah.
Seems like he had a plan all along.
Yeah, and remember his thing about subliminal indoctrination? Well, he's even tried to use the entertainment industry to spread his message.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's produced cartoons like Ninja, Karmakula, and Wailana's Little Yogis.
Wow, so he's not afraid to try different things.
Nope. And speaking of trying different things, did you know Butler was a musician for a bit?
No, really?
Yeah. He even released an album and told his followers to call radio stations and request his music.
Wow, that's wild. Seems like he really likes to use his influence in unusual ways.
Definitely. And those strict rules against hanging out with non-devotees, apparently those didn't always apply to Butler himself.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, there are stories about him going to Chinese restaurants and complaining to his followers that they weren't giving him better food options.
So he thought he was above the rules.
It seems that way, yeah. And speaking of double standards, we haven't even talked about the schools.
Right, the SIF schools. What's up with those?
Well, starting in the late 80s, Butler started pulling kids out of public school.
Oh, why?
He said it was to protect them from bad influences.
Okay.
So he created all these home schools and then boarding schools, mostly in the Philippines.
Oh, wow.
The idea was to surround them with SIF teachings and keep them away from the outside world.
I mean, on the surface, that doesn't sound terrible, right?
Yeah.
Like, parents want the best for their kids.
Right.
And they can choose how to educate them.
Yeah, but the stories from people who went to those schools paint a very different picture.
Oh, okay.
Like, former students have said it was really strict and controlled.
Okay.
They were taught to worship Butler and his wife as messengers of God.
Wow.
And some have even said they were punished harshly, kept isolated, and exposed to Butler's lectures that were sexually graphic and homophobic even when they were young.
Wow, that's heavy. It makes you wonder what the long-term effects of that are.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine.
Like to grow up believing all that and being cut off from other viewpoints?
Right, it must be really hard to break free from.
Definitely. And Mike Gabbard was part of that school system too, right?
Yeah, he ran a school in Hawaii before the ones in the Philippines got started.
Okay.
It was called Pono Maloa School in Wahiawa, Oahu.
Oh, wow.
And some people who went there, including some who ended up at the boarding school, have talked about their experiences.
Like what?
They were also taught to worship Butler and his wife, and they were exposed to the same problematic lectures that others have described.
So this really connects the Gabbard family to SIF's controversial practices.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow, so we're talking about possible indoctrination, isolation, and abuse in their school system. That's really different from the peaceful image they try to project.
Exactly. It shows that we can't just take things at face value.
Right.
We need to be critical and really dig deeper into any organization, especially one as powerful as SIF.
This has been eye-opening.
Yeah.
It's crazy how it all connects. The teachings, the recruitment, the politics, the cult-like behavior, the business stuff. It's a lot.
Definitely a lot to process. But remember, this is just a peek into a much bigger story.
Right.
There's still so much we don't know about Butler and SIF.
Yeah, that's true. But hopefully this deep dive has given people enough info to start forming their own opinions.
For sure.
This has been really insightful. But I think we need a minute to gather our thoughts.
Yeah, good idea.
We'll be back soon with our final takeaways and some closing thoughts. about Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation. All right, we're back, and wow, this deep dive into Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation has been a wild ride.
It really has.
Like, so much of what we've learned is fascinating and disturbing at the same time.
Yeah, definitely.
So as we wrap up, what are some of the key takeaways you think are most important for our listeners to remember?
Well, I think the biggest one is that things aren't always what they seem. SIF presents this image of peace and harmony on their spiritual path, but the stories from former members tell a very different story.
Right, like there's a huge gap between how they present themselves and what people actually experience.
Exactly. It's a good reminder to be careful and not just take things at face value.
Yeah, don't just believe what you see on the surface.
Right, especially with groups that demand total obedience or make big promises. You need to think critically.
Definitely. Do your research, look at different viewpoints, and ask tough questions before you commit to anything.
Absolutely. And we can't forget about SIF's political connections, especially with the Gabbard family.
Right. Yeah, that
Yeah.
raises some red flags about their influence in government.
For sure. We need more transparency from our leaders.
Totally. Transparency and ethical behavior are so important, especially for public officials.
Absolutely. We have to be aware of potential conflicts of interest and hidden agendas.
This whole deep dive has really made me think about how spirituality, business, and politics can get all mixed up.
Yeah, that's a messy combination.
SIF is involved in all of them, and it brings up a lot of ethical questions.
It definitely does. It reminds us that power can be used in so many ways, and sometimes it's the people who say they've given up worldly desires who are the best at getting and using it.
That's interesting.
Whether it's spiritual authority, money, or political power, it can be dangerous if it's not used responsibly.
So where do we go from here? What advice would you give to our listeners who now know all this about Chris Butler and SIF?
I would say keep asking questions and exploring. Don't just accept what you hear.
Okay.
Do your own research. Talk to ex-members if you can. Read analyses from different perspectives and come to your own conclusions.
This has been such an eye-opening experience. It really shows that the search for truth is never over.
You got it. There's always something new to learn and discover.
Well said.
Huh.
So as we wrap up this exploration, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought to think about.
Okay, what is it?
If a group says they have the answer to absolute truth and demands that you obey without question, you have to ask yourself, who benefits from that? The person seeking enlightenment or the leader seeking control?
That's a great question to consider.
We'll leave you with that as you continue to explore this complex and fascinating topic. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.